Our presentation is on how did the economic situation in Britain discourage decolonization and then encourage expansion of the British Commonwealth. On the next slide, I'll be giving an introduction. So after World War II, Britain had lost a significant amount of its economic power because of the outcome of World War II and kind of because of the outcome of World War I also. And they lost a significant amount of men because they died in the war, and this made them rely on the empire's dominions for workers. So basically they relied on other countries for the people in other countries to work for them. And they also rely on this empire to help with their economy after World War II too. So now I'll be talking about the YouTube video we watched called Freedom Now, and how it relates to our question with being how did the economic situation in Britain discourage decolonization and then encourage expansion of the British Commonwealth. So first off, Britain tried to convince the other countries or other colonies that they and their subjects lived peacefully side by side, and they were most determined to keep Africa because they saw no conflict between paternalism and profit. If you don't know what paternalism is, it's basically the idea that someone in position of authority can interfere with another person's liberty for their own good. So basically Britain wants to interfere with African colonies just for like their empire to help them out, and they're really not looking out after Africa. They're just worried about themselves. So after the Second World War, the African colonies were more valuable than ever to Britain. So Britain wanted to keep the African colonies they had power over after World War II because they wanted to only grow, they basically wanted to grow crops that they wanted to export back to Britain that would help benefit their, basically just help benefit Britain. So Europe's needs came first, and they used African lands to grow crops for export, and they paid the Africans very low wages, not food though, but they paid them very low wages trying to bolster their economy. And so the government fixed the prices of goods to keep prices low for the British to boost their economy. And the government was just basically looking out for the British so they can boost their economy and they can get back to where they need to be. So now I'll be talking about one of the specific people that the video mentioned, and his name is Kwame Nkrumah. And before I start talking about him, I like to say that the self-rule of Africa began in the Gold Coast, and the Gold Coast is basically one of the first African colonies to gain independence from Britain. So Kwame Nkrumah began boycotts of British goods in Africa, and he had a general strike in which led to him being placed in prison by the British. So while he was in prison, the British needed to have an election to replace the rule of the governor with African chiefs. So Nkrumah got out of prison, and the British hoped that he would lose the election to the conservative opponents he was going against. But it turns out that Nkrumah had won by a landslide, and then he began to fight for the independence of Africa. So the Brits fought to keep their rule over South Africa, but then they realized that they could not protect 1% of the African population who was white, and they had to listen to the African demands. So a guy named Harold Macmillan heard of the change and stated that the Brits would have to accept these changes and adjust their national policies, possibly alluding to the Commonwealth. So with the newfound political freedoms, Africans began to ask for economic freedom, And Nkrumah suggested scientific socialism, which is a political and social theory that uses scientific principles to analyze the relationships between economic classes in society. So he suggested that, but eventually they turned to autocracy, and no economic promises were made.
The Dominions were what helped keep Britain afloat during the wartime. Britain received food, soldiers, and supplies from the Dominions of Canada, Newfoundland, New Zealand, and Australia. From South Africa, they received material and ancillary supplies. But the whites in South Africa were adamant about not sending black soldiers because they did not want the blacks to think that it was okay to kill whites, nor did they want them to revolt. The sending of supplies represents Britain's reliance on its dominions for aid. Its main reasoning for doing this was that Britain wanted to ensure that its country was shielded from the deprivation and other negative side effects of war, so as to not upset the domestic stability of the dominions. Meaning that Britain wanted to ensure that it stayed strong in order to keep power over the dominions, even after the war. This desire was further represented in cases of South Africa, where blacks could not enter the war as soldiers, and in the country of India, where Indians were told by Linlithgow that they would be entering the war on behalf of Britain, without consulting any of the Indian leaders or the INC. In both of these cases, Britain has displayed that it would prefer to keep its colonies and its dominions under British rule rather than forgo British rule for their independence. And later this will be reflected in the countries that become part of the British Commonwealth, as those countries now have their independence. However, they still help to serve Britain. Propaganda during the war was used to help enforce the idea that Britain, no matter the struggles it's gone through, is still strong and as prosperous as ever. One such case of this is in the Britain Can Take It video. In this video, the British were seen to be getting bombed every night by German forces, whom they portrayed as cowards. Yet they still remained strong and continued about their days as if nothing had happened, and they were completely unbothered by the stresses of war. This would show that to their empire and dominions and colonies that Britain is unshaken and unbroken by the constant barrage of attacks, and it still has the power to maintain its empire. Inside the empire and film video, Britain was seen to have gotten many supplies from its dominions and colonies, those parts of its empire helping to keep its economy somewhat strong and keep the British people alive. These two videos together show Britain's reliance on its empire once again, but it also shows that Britain would prefer to continue to show its dominance over its empire than to admit that it is weakening, and it will likely not be able to support nor maintain an empire for much longer. This is because its empire was a large part of its economy. We've seen this inside of the pamphlets made during the war for African peoples, where Africans were told that the Nazis would enslave them and beat them, mistreat them, and steal their goods, not paying for them. But the British would pay them for their work and for their goods. This shows that Britain wants to portray itself as more than capable of running its empire and showing itself as a civilized country in order to keep its dominions and colonies under control to continue to support the British economy. World War II had decimated Britain's economy, so in order to assuage the economic hardship, Britain did two things. The first of the things they did was to employ Irish and European peoples into their workforce so that they could help continue to rebuild the economy and rebuild British cities. They then chose to do a Nationality Act in order to give everyone in the empire British identity, which would achieve a few goals. One of the goals would be that Britain could now have citizens of its empire come to Britain to work and help boost the economy with equal rights that a normal British citizen would have. It would also portray the idea that there is no need to declare independence from Britain because everyone is British in the British Empire. So there is no need for other nationalities outside of a British one. Britain again showing its taste for colonization and leaning more towards the idea of a commonwealth under British authority. The most effective forms of protest against the British government included labor unions and strikes. These labor unions and strikes, such as the salt strikes in India, would deeply impact the British economy because they would be losing money, weakening their empire, and weakening their economic standing. In an already weakened economy, Britain would have no choice but to accept the new terms that were requested by those doing the trade unions and strikes. This was even shown in the Freedom Now video, as Harold Macmillan, with his Winds of Change speech, told Britain that whether they liked it or not, change was coming and they had to accept and embrace it. His words would show that Britain had a great reluctance to decolonize, but they had to do something in order to maintain some type of economic relationship between the protesting dominions and colonies, which it would go on to favor the British Commonwealth. In each of these situations, Britain has strongly favored keeping its colonies and its dominions in order to boost its economy. But in the end, Britain did not have the power nor funds to continue a total imperial empire. Instead, they had to create a commonwealth of countries that would still help to support Britain, but would not be under direct British rule nor direct British command. Thank you for listening to our video attempting to answer the question, how did the economic situation in Britain discourage decolonization and then encourage the expansion of the British Commonwealth? Here are our sources. Thank you once again, Mercutio, John, and Riley.